Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, man. We appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so it's really cool to get to meet you, to see your studio, and talk to you about your own cartooning history. Since you saw one of the episodes, we talked to people about their influences, their cartooning like loves, and how it kind of affected their career paths and their own work. So we know you hail from Minnesota.
Yes, grew up in Wisconsin actually, but ended up in Minnesota for college and then settled in Minnesota after that.
And can you think back all the way back to like your earliest recollection of a cartoon that hit your eyes first, whether it's comic strips, comic books, or TV or movie, animated cartoon? Something that you remember really early.
Well, that's an easy one. I'm sure people watching this, I should let you know I'm a Batman fan. I don't know if that's obvious, but when I was a really little kid, I loved the Adam West Batman TV show, and I'm talking 2 years old, before I could really even do anything. And that theme music would come on the TV, and I'd come running. And then I just be riveted and sit and watch the TV. And then my mom would take a safety pin and pin a bath towel around my neck. So then I'd run and I'd look behind me to make sure my cape was properly flapping. And so Batman interested me a lot. And then my dad was a manager of a grocery store. He actually worked for a grocery store chain, and we moved around a lot. When I was a kid, he'd moved to different small towns where one of the grocery stores was doing badly. And then he was like the fixer, and he would manage it for a year and a half, 2 years, until he got it back in ship shape, and then off he'd go. So he used to bring home the comic books from the spinner racks that didn't sell at the end of the month. If it didn't sell and the new ones came in, what you would do is you would tear the cover off and send the cover back for a refund. And then you're supposed to destroy the comics. Well, in fact, it was years later I realized comics are supposed to have covers. But I have all these comics, and Batman, of course, was one of the ones he'd bring home a lot, but also like more kids comics when I was that age, 5, 6, 7 years old, like the Harvey books, Richie Rich and Casper, and then the Duck books, the Disney books. Carl Barks, was one of the first ones I remember knowing this guy was an artist, and I loved the Duck books, and that's what got me into drawing. And I would sit downstairs and draw my own comics and create my own characters, and that I fell in love through comic books, really, with art.
That's so cool. Do you remember your first Batman comic?
Not specifically. I had so many of them, and none of them had covers. It was just like the stories. But this would have been in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. So when I first started getting these comics, and I believe that Carmen Infantino was doing most of the art at that time. So he was probably the first Batman artist I was really exposed to. And then later on, Neil Adams became the Batman artist of the 70s. And so, I was it was like late single digits, early, kind of tweens years when I really started getting into the more sophisticated Batman comics, And I loved other heroes too, and other stories. And when Star Wars came out in 77, I was 11. And that, I was a perfect age.
Perfect age.
So then I started getting into science fiction comics, and I bought the Star Wars books and fantasy books, Conan, and all sorts of stuff like that. And so I just couldn't get enough comic books when I was that age. And I read all sorts of, different kinds of stories and everything. And then I discovered Mad Magazine around age 12. And I was a huge Mad fan for, all my adolescent years. But I couldn't get it. My parents wouldn't let me. So, yeah, I wasn't allowed. In fact, my parents still don't know I work for Mad. So if you run into them, don't mention it.
Right.
No, one of my buddies down the street had a subscription, so
Funny.
when the new one came out, then he'd call me and I'd run over there, and we would draw our own Don Martin cartoons and our own wacky packages. That wasn't Mad, but it was Mad. Yeah, it was like Mad-like stuff. Yeah. And we would draw those, and so humor was something that also resonated for me, not just superheroes or more serious stories. So I kind of like the whole spectrum.
So it was always comics, always, yeah.
Pretty much comic strips too. Like, I knew about the comic strips and I would read the comic strips on the paper, but that didn't catch my eye as much as the longer stories and the characters and stuff like that. Although Peanuts was a big favorite. I had an aunt. My dad had a lot of really younger sisters like that were just only a few years older than I was, and they loved Peanuts, and so I saw a lot of Peanuts collections and stuff with that. So the shorter form stuff too was a lot of fun. But yeah, I have to say comics were it for me.
So were you a kid in school? Like, were you drawing constantly, drawing on homework, drawing on tests, doing that? Like, were you someone who was always scribbling, or? Yeah,
I like to say that I did all of my, I learned art in math class, and I learned math in art class, because my teachers would give us an art assignment and I'd be done with it by the end of the first period, and everybody else would have to work on it for 3 weeks. So I'd then do my homework during math class. But I was always scribbling and drawing, and all my notebooks were full of comics. So I used to draw stories about my friends and I on adventures. And in fact, I did one where we were all babies. And so I did like these caricatures of us as babies. And one of my buddies, his name was Bill. He was like this tough guy. And so they were Baby Bill comics. And Bill was busy bullying everybody and being a dick. But he was a baby. So it was funny because he had like 5 o'clock shadow in as a freshman in high school.
Oh, yeah. One of those guys.
So the baby had 5 o'clock shadow.
Nice.
Yeah.
You still have any of those?
Nah, I don't have any of those. Yeah. Who knows what happened to those?
So, like, intuitively, you were already doing caricatures pretty early on.
Well, yeah, that was the funny thing was, now that's sort of my identity is caricature. And back then, I didn't know what caricature was. Like, I didn't know what the word meant, or that what I was doing was caricature. I was just drawing people. And that's just how I did it, and it was years later that I got that label sort of, I guess that is what I'm doing. But when I was in grade school, I think it was maybe about 6th grade, I was taking an art class at my middle school, and the art room was part of this great big huge industrial arts room. So there was like the shop class was also in the same room. It was this giant room, and we were on these workbenches, and I was on one of the back benches, and my teacher was teaching a unit on caricature that he was just starting. And so he was up there explaining what caricature was, and I wasn't paying any attention. I was drawing a caricature of the other teacher who was teaching shop class behind us. He was a really funny looking dude he had like this giant neck and these big horn rim glasses. And so my teacher saw me that I wasn't paying attention, and he kind of snuck up behind me and yelled at me. And then he grabbed my pad of paper away and he looked at it and he says, "You're going to see me after class." And I'm like, man, great. So then I finished the class, and then afterwards, well, I didn't get into trouble. He sent me around the school to draw all the teachers. And then I had a little show of my work outside the classroom. And so I did all these caricatures, and then I forgot all about caricature until I applied for a job doing them while I was in college at a Six Flags.
That's funny. So when you kind of were recognized for doing caricatures surreptitiously in class, and then had this show, like, what else were you drawing at the time? Like, just your own comic kind of stuff?
Yeah, at that time I was still into comics. Probably, at some point in high school, I kind of pivoted away and I was more interested in music. So I was doing, like album cover sort of art, and kind of experimenting with painting and things like that. And I stopped buying comics. That was sort of a dark age in the early 80s of comics. And I remember some really, really dumb Batman villains and stuff that I just thought were, okay, I guess I'm not interested in this stuff anymore. And I stopped getting Mad magazine too. I had moved away from my buddy, so I didn't have the inside.
Lost your fix.
Mad thing. Yeah, exactly. So I stopped reading Mad. It was more about, like, I remember copying album covers, trying acrylics and watercolors and things like that. And I don't know, trying to do more serious art, whatever that means. And I was doing editorial cartoons, actually, for the school newspaper. And so that I was still kind of cartooning a little bit there and getting in trouble doing caricatures of my teachers, of course. But I went to a tiny little school in rural Minnesota, or southern Minnesota. My class had like 100 people in it. And so I was the artist of the class. So anytime any art stuff had to be done, I was always the one that got tapped for that. And so editorial cartoons for the school newspaper and stuff for the yearbook and, that kind of stuff. But then it wasn't until I went to college and I was going to school for art, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. Comics was off my radar by then. I just didn't know if I could make a living doing comics, And so I was just went to school, and figured, okay, I guess I'll figure it out. And then I found I was in the art commons area of our school. I was going to the U of M, University of Minnesota, big school that had a little art program that wasn't very good. And I was just hanging around the arts building, and there was a poster on the wall that said, "Can you draw?" And it was an ad looking for caricature artists to work at a theme park nearby. And so I applied for the job, and I didn't get it. I did not get the job. I was rejected.
Wow.
But then later on, the same people called me up and said, well, we don't have a spot here in Minnesota at the park, but we do have one that just opened up. Somebody else had backed out of working down in Chicago, near Chicago, at a park called Six Flags, Great America. And you can, if you want to move down there for the summer, they said, we can give you a job down there. So I moved down there the summer of 85. And I drew some caricatures there all summer and did it every summer for the next 25 years.
Wow.
Not for them. For them, I worked for 4 years for them, and then...
Was that the Fazens?
Yeah, Fazen Arts. So that's that. And I fell in love with caricature at that summer. I was working with all these cool artists, and they were all doing all these really great caricatures and this highly creative atmosphere. And, all of us lived in a townhouse together, and when we weren't drawing, we were drawing. That's about it. It was fun.
That's cool. So then did you get back into Mad around then?
Yeah, exactly around then. Because I moved down there and I didn't know any of these guys. And I just moved into this townhouse, and they had some were already there because I had to finish my school semester. And then there were like Mad magazines laying all over the apartment. So I'm looking through them going, man, was the art this good in these magazines when I was reading them back when I was 12? And yeah, of course they were, Mark Drucker, Jack Davis, Angelo Torres, Sam Bibiano, Woodbridge. I mean, it's like an all-star list. Al Jaffy, Sergio Aragones. So I got back into Mad at that time. And and then I didn't apply to be in Mad for 15 years, but at that time it was pretty cool to see this. Now I'm doing this work, this kind of art, caricaturing, exaggerating people like I saw in the magazine, but with people sitting in front of me for $5 and with people with cotton candy breath behind me, asking me where the bathrooms are and getting distracted.
Yeah, that's one of the most important things to learn as a caricature artist. It's,
where's the
bathroom?
Yeah.
So did you get much extensive training from like Gary or Steve at that time?
They had sort of like a little, boot camp kind of thing at the beginning where they really taught you the basics. But really I learned most of it just sitting next to, Gary, Fazin, some of the other artists that were working there. There were three artists that first summer that were really experienced, and then there were three new people. I was one of the new people. And Gary was the manager and the boss. And then there was an artist named Dave Camish who was drawing there. And then another guy named Mark Sanislow. And Dave went on to do animation for Warner Brothers. He worked on the Animaniacs and he did children's books. And, he was super talented. And Mark is like a professional portrait artist now. He still does caricatures here and there. They were all from here. We were all from Minnesota. So we all moved down there for the summer. And there were no Chicago-based artists. Well, there was one, a guy named Chuck Sentiez. He was a new guy with me and another artist named Scott Rolfs. And we were, the rookies. And it was only 6 artists. And they also did airbrush T-shirts. And one of the T-shirt artists was Doug Mankey.
Oh, yeah.
It was his first summer doing T-shirts, and he was one of my roommates, and we're real good friends. And of course, Doug is a top level comic book artist now for everybody. He's a great guy, super talent. So, I was drawing with all these really talented people, and watching them work was an education in itself, Plus, it didn't hurt that I drew about 3,000 faces that summer too.
Right.
So.
Yeah, just the mileage really.
The sheer practice of it was, but it was a great experience. I recommend for caricature artists to do some live work, even if it's not their bag, but it's a great dynamic. It really opens up your eyes and develops your instincts. And it's a nice, kind of way to get out of overthinking things in the studio that you sometimes do.
Yeah, just like
gleaned from knowing Chris that it's that like you don't even think, you just draw. It's a remarkable thing. I am forcing myself to do live drawing. Is it May 3rd? The National Cartoonist Society is doing an event in Massachusetts.
That's
cool.
It's Jeff Kinney's bookstore, and so they asked a bunch of the people to go up and come early and draw for the kids.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, I'll volunteer. I'll do it.
That's great. Yeah, it's drawing without a net, so it can be pretty intimidating. But it's good to get out of your comfort zone.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
When you were drawing then live, did they dictate like no underdrawing, no sketching, just go right into it? I know you were really vehement about us, not messing with any undersketching, or just get used to bold lines and you'll catch up as you go along.
Yeah, that was 100% a Fazin thing, and I sort of just continued that because that's how I learned. But Steve was Gary's older brother, and he would sometimes be down there, but mostly it was Gary. But Gary would tell you, don't do any sketching and don't do any erasing. Like if you draw a line, you live with the line, you don't erase it. And that was, they didn't let you do it. So, and that's scary, to have to just draw cold like that. But I know there's something magical about a drawing just appearing on the paper without any sketching at all. It's like watching somebody do a sculpture, in high speed with a hammer, just chipping away, and all of a sudden a figure appears. That's like, how did they do that? Well, it's all, you do it in your head,
right?
And then you execute it on the paper. So I just got done teaching a caricature workshop this weekend, and we do a live caricature unit for a couple of hours, and everybody has to draw everybody else in the class, and you get 5 minutes. That's it. And so I demonstrate the technique and everything, and then we all just draw for a couple of hours. And it's intense, but you'd be surprised how oftentimes some of the best drawings some of these artists do all weekend is then. because they don't have time to overthink it. It's what I call reactionary drawing. Like you're reacting to your model, and it's 100% instinct and quick observation, and a lot of times that's much more accurate when you're trying to capture somebody than if you sit there and study and study and study and try to work it out analytically. It's your reaction to somebody is usually truer than thinking about it.
And that's like a muscle. The more you do it, the better you get at it, the easier it becomes. So
true.
Yeah, I think it's tough in the beginning to get over that hump, but once you do, you're glad you went through those trials.
Yeah, for sure.
So when did Now Comics get on your radar? How did that connection come up?
I moved to after I got done with college. I had done 4 summers for Fosn's at Great America, and I just gotten married, and they offered me a job in Atlanta. They had just gotten the contract at Six Flags Atlanta to do caricatures and airbrush T-shirts down there. And so they offered me the management position. And so I had to move down to Atlanta. So my brand new wife and I moved to Atlanta, and I worked down there for 2 summers. And one of the artists, Chuck Centias, came with me, my buddy that I'd been drawing with. And he had found out that Now Comics was looking for artists. Now was a comic book publishing company out of the Chicago area. And they did a lot of licensed properties. So they did the Ghostbusters comic book that was based on the original Ghostbusters, not the Dan Aykroyd or Harold Ramis movie. The guys with the monkey or the ape. Yeah. And Green Hornet. They did Green Hornet, and they did a comic called Ralph Snart, and that was creator-owned Mark Hansen.
Yeah.
And anyway, Now was notorious for not paying on time or well or sometimes at all. So they were having problems keeping artists. And Chuck was sending him Ralph Snart stuff because they were looking for somebody to take over Ralph Snart. And he said they found out he was a caricaturist, and they asked him if he wanted to submit some stuff for another title they did called Married with Children that was based on the Fox TV show. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't sure he wanted to do that or was able to do that, but he told me about it. He says, you should send him some stuff. So I did. I wrote my own little story with the Bundys. It's like a 3-page thing where the dog Buck steals Al's wallet and is running around the house, and everybody's chasing him. And then when they catch him, the wallet is empty, of course, because it never had anything in it to begin with. But I sent it to him, and I got the job. So I was penciled Married with Children comics for a couple of years.
The first time that you wrote, was that your first writing experience?
I guess it probably was. Other than the little comics that I'd been writing my whole life.
Right, writing. Yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't get paid to write that. So that was just
to get the job.
Simple. Somebody else wrote the comic. I just penciled it. So I was a penciler, and then, there were multiple inkers on it, and then there was a colorist. So I just did the pencils. But I'd not done professional comics before, so it was an interesting experience. I got better at it towards the end. Towards the end of the run, I went from work that today I'm incredibly embarrassed by to the point where towards the end I was like, okay, I'm kind of getting the hang of this. And then it was over. Now Comics went out of business.
So how many issues, give or take, do you think you did?
20, maybe 30, I guess. I think I figured out I did about 600 pages for them. And it was over the course of quite a while, like 4 years, because they were pretty sporadic with their publishing. When I started with them, they'd already had 4 issues out of Married with Children that other artists had done. And then I did issue 5 and 6, and then they started over with a new volume because, number 1 issues sell. And then they kept on redoing number 1 issues. Like there might be 50 number 1 Married with Children number 1s out there. But most of them are like miniseries. We did a lot of weird miniseries that were spoofs. Like there was a Fantastic Four spoof we did once called Quantum Quartet.
Yeah.
And the gag was that Bud Bundy was trying to write a comic. He was trying to be a comic book writer, and he goes to a Comic-Con, and this is his story is his family as the Quantum Quartet, so the Fantastic Four. And Kelly was the Thing, and he was the Human Torch, of course. But anyway, it was weird. There was some weirdness, strange things. Fun.
That's wild. But that's a great kind of training ground for your later comic stuff. Like, did that experience make you want to do more comics, or?
Yeah, I enjoyed doing them. I enjoyed doing comics. Especially I'm glad that I was doing humorous ones, because that was much more in my wheelhouse than trying to do serious comics, and in fact, I think by the time I got done with the humorous comic run, I was thinking, I don't know if I could do realistic comics.
Right.
The art college I went to had no cartooning classes at all. I learned nothing about cartooning or comics or animation or anything like that. It was straight illustration. They had a fine arts program, they had a graphic design program. So it was all realistic painting and drawing and that type of thing. So, I was capable of that stuff, but I didn't really like it. And probably I would have had to really get the hang of, drawing cities in perspective and all that kind of stuff. It was very laborious for me. I could do it, but boy, it took, forever to get it to look right. So I was much happier doing, more loosey-goosey humor comics where things weren't, didn't need to be quite so tight.
Right.
But to this day, I can still draw the Bundy's living room in perfect perspective. I know where all the lamps were. I know where the bookcase was, the couch pattern, the weird stairs that went up that had brick around it. Go figure. Right.
That's funny. Did you ever get to do any of your own inking? I know, like now you're known for your tight classic inking. Did you do any of your own inking on those?
Just on a couple of covers. There were a couple of covers that I inked, and you know what? I was a terrible inker. Like, I didn't even know how to do it. I'd never had a single lesson on how to ink. I just was winging it, And in fact, when I started with Mad, I wasn't particularly good at inking because I had never learned or had any. I bought the Marvel book, and there was an inking section in there. That was my inking education right there.
Oh, wow.
So when I started with Mad, I had Sam Viviano, who was the art director when I started there. I called him and said, hey, what would you charge me to come to New York and have you give me a inking workshop? And so he's like, well, so we worked something out, and I flew to New York, and I spent a whole day with him in his studio, and I brought one of my Mad pages with me. Actually, one I'd already inked, and then I repenciled it so that I could ink it again.
Oh, wow.
And he showed me a lot about inking. And I got a lesson from Joe Rubinstein.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, the comic book inker and artist. And he used to be an assistant for Wally Wood,
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And in fact, our mutual buddy Ed Steckley and I went to Rubinstein's when Ed was running things for me in New England. We went into New York. I'd met Joe through Debbie Schaefer, who was another caricature artist. She was dating him at the time, and so we just went to his studio in New York, and we watched him ink for like a whole day and heard these great stories. So that's how I learned how to do that stuff, and then just kind of figuring it out on my own.
Cool. So did you start right away with brush, or were you doing more like quill or like?
Nope. I used dip pens almost exclusively. I still do. I use more brush these days, but almost all dip pens. And I blame my live caricature experience on that because I'm so heavy-handed from pressing so hard when I do live caricatures that a brush needs a very light, touch, and I didn't have it. Like, I would be painting with the with the whole width of the brush the whole time. And like, no, you're supposed to just use the point. I'm like, I can't do that. How can you do that? So I'm better at it now, but at the time, forget it. So I used really stiff pen nibs. That was like the only way that I could ink. And I still use probably 80% pen nibs.
That's cool. So I know you did another kind of weekend informal workshop with Herman Mejia. You guys did kind of a hangout where he showed you some.
Yeah, watercolor.
Stuff.
That was just us getting together and like eating pizza and drinking beer at Ed's place in New York and sitting around working with watercolors. So there was no teaching going on. We were just watching him do it, and we were doing it. But I learned a lot, watching him work.
Sometimes that's the best way. Just like as visual people, it's like seeing somebody do it goes a long way.
Yeah, for sure. That was a lot of fun. I still have. Well, actually, I think I gave that piece that I did. I remember I did a caricature of Matt Damon while we were just sitting around there. It's only about this big. But it was fun. It's always great to watch another artist's work, just trying to climb into their head a little bit and see how they do things. It's really always an eye opener. So yeah, that was fun. Great. I learned some watercolor. I took some watercolor classes after college. Surprisingly, we hardly ever did watercolor work in college. There was a lot of gouache. There was a lot of acrylics and a couple of other techniques, but gouache was it. I mean, these instructors that I had were all working illustrators, but they were all trained in the 60s.
Right. So they were the gouache generation, mid-century generation that gouache.
Yeah. And I hated working with gouache.
Well, it's temperamental.
Yeah, it's so chalky. It was the way that I like to work. Didn't work with gouache. You couldn't go back over it. Yeah. It was just okay. So it just was. I used it and I could fake it, but I was much more comfortable with acrylics.
Yeah.
And watercolor, for whatever reason, was the one thing that I seemed to gravitate towards. I like the look of it. I think probably more than anything.
Yeah. And I always say, like, watercolor, you can see your drawing. That's the thing I like about it. So you never lose your drawing when you're working in watercolor.
Yeah.
So when you were doing the Married with Children comics, you were still caricaturing. So that was your kind of the start of, Chris tells me that you're a great juggler of many things. So that was kind of like the first entree into that. Like, all right.
Yeah.
Lots of pots on the stove boiling at the same time.
Yeah. The Married with Children comic might be the first comic book series created in plein air. Like I penciled most of those pages sitting out at the park on rainy days, and so people would come by and go, "What are you doing?" Well, I'm working on a comic book page, and I put it away, and then I'd start, I'd do a caricature, and I'd pick it back up. But my goal was to be a freelance illustrator, so you better be ready to juggle a lot of balls if you're going to do that, because you can't just focus on one project and then finish it and wait for the next one to start. You've got a lot of them going at the same time.
Yeah.
Like you say, a lot of pots on the stove.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I was telling Kelly, and I remember it distinctly, however accurate it might be, but I remember asking you early on in my Six Flags caricature career, like, man, what do you draw for fun? And you're like, I haven't drawn for fun in 5 years. Like, but the sentiment being like, there's no time to just sit around and draw for fun. Like, if you're drawing and you have time, then you're drawing something for a client or like something actual,
Well, that's true for me, and always has been. Like, I haven't had a sketchbook in 30 years, But that isn't to say that I don't have fun drawing. I'm just lucky enough that most of my jobs are fun, and it's something that I love to do. So I get I scratch my artistic itch with my jobs, I'm very lucky that way. For a while there, I would go to some life drawing co-ops where you throw $5 in the coffee jar to pay for the model, and you sit around for 3 hours and do a bunch of life drawing. realistic. And I really enjoyed that because for a while there, the caricature thing was just, it's like always exaggerating, always caricature. And it's just fun to stretch a different set of muscles, you know. And so I took a couple watercolor classes too around that time, which were, you know, landscape sort of stuff or still lifes that were realistic. And that I found that relaxing. And just because, you know, I'm just rendering and creating a different feel to the art. And so that part was fun, but it wasn't something I needed. I just did it, you know, because it was fun and nice to get away from things. But it wasn't like if I didn't do that, I'd go crazy, because when I got home, I got to do some fun stuff. And so pretty lucky that way.
Well, it's great that you wanted to scratch that itch on your own, because so many caricature artists are brilliant at drawing the face, but like, you know, skip everything else. So you see that kind of.
Yeah, that's something I get a lot of people that ask me, a lot of live caricature artists that, you know, ask me, how do you get into freelancing? And, you know, how do you do that? You know, I really want to do that. And I tell them, well, first of all, this isn't the whole world right here. And caricature is only a small part of being an illustrator. If you're good at caricature, it's a great tool to have in your tool belt, because when you think about it, most stories or media, whatever, are about people ultimately. So if you can draw people, and especially in a way that photography can't really duplicate, that's a great skill to have. I mean, almost everybody needs that at some point. But illustration's about storytelling. You know, it's about narratives. Just do faces, you're pretty limited. You know, you've got to be able to tell a story. I had a guy who worked for me at my park here in Minnesota. This was a long time ago. And he was a really, really talented artist, and he had his portfolio, and he keeps showing me his portfolio, and it was full of all these different styles. Like, he had stuff that was it was cross-hatchy and sort of David Levine-ish, although not as rigid as that. It was more loose. And then he had some charcoal type stuff. And a lot of it was caricature, because he was really interested in caricature at the time. And I was doing work for the Minnesota Twins and some local magazines, Minnesota Business Monthly and Twin Cities Magazine, and a few magazines where I would be doing caricatures of local politicians or something, you know, or sports people with stories about them. And I said, well, you know, you should bring your portfolio into those guys and show it to them, because you do all sorts of your styles that are different than what I do, and they might be interested in that sort of look. So he went there, and he came back like a week later and told me, hey, I've got a job. You know, I'm doing an illustration of, and it was a caricature of Denny Green, who was the Minnesota Vikings coach at the time, the football team. And it's a story about Denny Green, and I'm doing this caricature of him for the story. And I said, great. And I said, what did they like about your portfolio? And he said, oh, they really like these pieces. And he showed me some of the cross-hatching ones. I said, oh, that's cool. Well, you know, make sure that you deliver what they expect.
Yeah.
And then a couple days later, he shows me this piece that he was ready to bring in, and it was an airbrush park caricature of Denny Green, like a nice one.
Yeah.
But it was nothing like what he had shown them. He didn't have any of that kind of stuff in his portfolio. And I said, man, they're not going to like this. This is not what they expected.
Right.
Oh, this is where I think this is the way it needs to be done. I think this looks great. I'm like, okay. So he brought it in. They rejected it, paid him the kill fee. He never got it published. And, you know, because it was just a big Denny Green head, you know, instead of what they were probably looking for, style-wise and narrative-wise. So that's my advice to caricature artists, live caricature artists, is learn to draw bicycles and environments, and getting your caricatures part of a scene and an environment and a narrative that tells whatever message your job requires. And, you know, the caricature part's great, but it's just part of it.
Right. Do you feel like you've gotten to learn more about that over the years through like groups like the NCN, which became ISCA, and then the NCS as well? Like meeting other artists around?
Yeah, I guess so. But I've always been able to do that sort of thing. You know, the caricature, park caricatures was always a separate thing for me. I absolutely developed my style of caricature doing them out there, but I could turn the park part off, where it wasn't just, doing a goofy caricature of somebody. And I also was always able to turn up and down the mean guy part of the caricature if necessary. So if I was doing an article or an illustration for an article about some politician that was really critical of that person, then I could do a nasty caricature of them, that made them look ridiculous. But if I was doing a piece for Sports Illustrated Kids and doing an athlete, like, they don't want me to make those people look bad. So then I would do more of a likeness orientated, it was more just a whimsical, fun, humorous likeness of the person, lighthearted but not insulting, and that worked better for that particular job. So it's all about whatever it is you're supposed to deliver. You have to understand what the art director's asking for and then give it to them.
Right. Yeah, like you said, what they're expecting. If you give them something out of left field, they're not going to like it.
Yeah.
Point. Did you turn into the caricature, what would the word be, coach of millions of minions? At what point did that you managed the booth in Atlanta, but then eventually you started to have your own, right? Own booths. How did that kind of happen so that then, young aspiring artists like Chris came in,
everything, I feel like even back then, everything that went into the book, you pretty much had a good handle on it. So did that just come from training so many artists? Did you just out of necessity?
Yeah, I just really recently got out of that business. But there was a time when I had 7 operations in 4 different states and probably 120 artists working for me during a summertime. So I would teach everybody, the techniques and stuff. And I had like a little manual that I had written that was, just a much smaller version of what that book is. Yeah. But people were after me to do a book for a long time. People say, you should write a book, you should write a book, you should write a book. I'm like, how am I going to find time to write a book? And then a caricature artist named Celestia Ward, who lives in Las Vegas, and she's a member of now the ISCA, International Society of Caricaturists. At the time, it was the NCN, National Caricatures Network. And she also was an editor, like she was a book editor in the Baltimore area for a number of years before she really started doing art full time. And she said, if you ever want to write a book, I will edit it for you. And I really want to do this because I think you really have have to share, and I think it would be great. So I didn't even really remember what the catalyst was, but one day I just said, you know what, I've got to stop screwing around and just write this damn book. So I kind of started avoiding jobs, or kind of turning down some jobs and only taking on jobs that I really had to take. And I devoted about 3 months to writing this book. And I went to coffee shops. I got out of my studio so that I had none of my drawing stuff around me and no jobs in front of me that I could work on. And I would spend 3 hours a day at this coffee shop writing this book for 3 months. And then by that time, with lots of my projects, it's the same thing for me. It's like once I reach a certain critical mass on a project, I can't stop working. Like I have to finish this now. It's like it's like a ball rolling down the hill. At some point, nothing's going to stop it till it gets to the bottom, So then I had to illustrate it, and it took me another couple of months to do all the drawings for it and put it together. And I was working with Celestia back and forth, sending chapters and all this stuff. And then I had to learn how to put it together in InDesign because I'd never designed a book before. and I did all the production and all that stuff on it, and off it went. So, and I self-published it. This was before crowdfunding, so
yeah,
that wasn't a thing back in 2011 when it came out. So I had to pay, to print it, and so it was kind of a leap of faith. I thought, well, I'll pay a lot of money to print this thing. Hopefully, I'll sell all these. Right. And just got my 13th printing of it done last December, so it's been doing fine. That's but awesome. Yeah, it's actually amazing that it's just a very steady, not spectacular, but it keeps selling. Amazon keeps ordering copies from me, and then my stock dwindles down, and then I have to do another printing. So it's been a fun ride with that.
That's awesome. And then
actually tell caricature artists that have learned from different mentors, right? That
really
that somehow, even though everybody develops their own style, that there's a little bit of this, like something that sticks from you to all of your artists who was, the artists that were trained by you. You said somebody else called Commons once.
Yeah.
Like you can always tell
there's a handful out there. And yeah, if you work a gig or if you work a big fair or something, and you can see artists maybe you haven't met before, but you can kind of tell their lineage by how they construct a face, whether they start inside out, whether they go outside in, and you can kind of see a lot of the effect or affects of these artists, so you can kind of, it's cool to see, like, clearly at least spent a summer or two at a Richmond booth.
I think the Foz and Richmond is kind of interchangeable. Although I see specific artists in some that I've known that train people in some people's work. So I can spot somebody that was trained by Gary Fozen in a heartbeat. Like there's Gary in their drawings. I can see it. And same with Commons. Dino Casterline was the artist that kind of started the Commons style. And he wrote their manual, so that's part of it.
Yeah.
But I see the Dino style in lots of artists. I just had a guy at my workshop in Toronto who lives in the New York area, and he's been doing gig caricatures for 20 years or something like that. And I watched him draw, and I said, "You started at Commons, didn't you?" And he said, "Yeah, I did. I worked at Lake, Dominion Park or whatever, Dorney Park or something like that." And I was like, "Yep, I can see it."
It's wild.
Yeah, it's cool to see so many different, but it's funny how some artists that come up through the theme parks have an approach, but then artists that have been outliers and avoided that path and only doing gigs have kind of their own.
Yeah. Well, it's again a function of just the sheer volume that you draw, and you learn from somebody and you're applying that and you do it, for thousands and thousands and thousands of faces, and the muscle memory comes into, and just the visual cues are all so deeply embedded that you end up, you can't avoid it coming out of you.
Right. Then now with like proliferation of, I don't know if you've seen it as much with your artists, but you can see a lot on social media that it's like almost a generation spawned from like Cartoon Network. A lot of live caricature artists have a very, Steven Universe or there's kind of a new animated kind of style creeping into the.
Yeah, you see that, and I see, manga creeping into a lot of caricature artists. Not that their caricatures look like, the sort of generic manga face, but just the way they handle certain things, like, the highlights in the eyes and things like that are manga influenced, or how they de-emphasize the lines around the nose or something. And but that's the nature of art. You absorb things around you, things that resonate with you, and you either intentionally or unintentionally incorporate it into your own work, and then it becomes part of your DNA. And then that's it. It's hard to purge yourself from that. And why would you want to? Because it's part of your identity.
Right. Could you say which artist really had that effect on you early on? Because like you've got a great ability to mimic other artists, like when you have to for different assignments, and that's a good tool to have in your tool bag for the versatility, but you have such a distinctive style and such a consistent distinctive style. Like, can you pinpoint a few artists that really made that lasting impression early on?
Well, early on, it was all the comic book guys, and none of that stuff is in my work anymore at all. That just inspired me to draw, and I tried to copy Carmen Infantino and Neil Adams, but that eventually just sort of washed away. But when I started doing more humorous work, obviously the Mad Guys were huge. But a lot of people associate my work with Mort Drucker's work, but Mort was not, it's like my number 3 maybe artist who worked for Mad. Maybe even number 4. Well, my absolute number 1 artist whose work I admired and just still look at and just ogle over it was Wally Wood. And you don't see a lot of Wood stuff in my stuff, I don't think. But his work was, I think he's hands down the greatest artist that ever worked for Mad. And that's saying something, And then after Wood, it would be Jack Davis. And again, I don't see a lot of Jack in my stuff other than sometimes the more manic figures, or whatnot. But I don't do like the Jack Davis feat. There's not an overt influence there. All this stuff is underneath,
Right.
And people, that's why people think probably that Mort was my biggest influence, because of all those artists, my work resembles Mort's more than anybody's. But it's mostly because I do cartoon caricature likenesses that are very likeness orientated and not as exaggerated as some artists' approaches are. And I do it in line, and I use kind of an economy of line with what I do rather than a lot of cross-hatching or a lot of heavy line work. And so there's a superficial resemblance to Mort's stuff with mine. But if you put a caricature that I did of Morgan Freeman next to a caricature that Mort did of Morgan Freeman, they couldn't, they're super different.
Right.
So my thinking of how I draw is very different, but some of the cartoon kind of ways that I render things are similar. So I end up getting you're a Mort Drucker guy, but that's not a bad thing because he was the best of the best. And then my other artist is Al Jaffy.
Oh, yeah.
Which is funny because there's no Jaffy in my work.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily pick that up, but yeah.
Yeah, but his inventiveness and a lot of just the way that he would stage, his storytelling was all stuff that just made me laugh so hard that, I think about him sometimes in certain situations when I'm doing things and go, I know how Jaffy would do this. And then underneath all that is really Kurtzman, from the early Mad.
Yeah, his work was beautiful.
Yeah.
There was more of it, as the years went on. It was so good.
Well, so much of what Wood did and what Jack Davis did and what those early Mad artists did was Kurtzman, because he did layouts that were so exact that basically these guys just drew their versions of Kurtzman's staging, and he invented comic book things that today get used and people don't even realize that Kurtzman invented it.
Right. Yeah, this is the comic book language, the storytelling language.
Like one of the things is when you do somebody that is walking and they stay center panel and the action goes past them, panel to panel, and there are crazy things going on and they're just walking, and that was a Kurtzman thing. And the kind of 3-panel setup to a final action gag, he would lay that out, and Wood would be the master of being able to do that. But that was a lot of Kurtzman thinking. He was a comic book genius.
To go to see the Mad show at the Rockwell.
Good for you, yeah.
And that was really mind-blowing, that exhibit, to be able to see it, not only to be able to see it as this complete kind of timeline of the magazine, but also that it was there in what is like a church of illustration.
Yes, the context.
It was just amazing. And when you were talking about Al Jaffy, the Al Jaffy wall, like, I may have spent the most time staring at being able to see the fold ends as originals and to see, what a good painter. Like,
Yeah.
it's one thing, like, it was always my favorite thing as a kid to do the fold ins, but to see them on the wall like that, all like next to it was it was just so mind blowing.
Yeah, and the fact that he did that all long before the computer age came along, where you could, do that on the computer and get it all figured out. He did it himself and made it work, and analog.
Yeah.
Al probably is the all-time Mad greatest cartoonist. I would say he's the greatest cartoonist that ever worked for Mad. And though Sergio Aragonés is right up there also. Those two guys could duke it out, and it would depend on your own personal preference. But those guys were capable of anything, especially Al. He could do anything. And he was so inventive and creative, and the things that he would come up with became like huge, Mad Magazine icon things, like the snappy answers to stupid questions and the fold in and the inventions, that he would do. And that's all him. Like, he came up with the fold in because Penthouse had and Playboy had the fold, the centerfold that would fold out. He's like, and Gaines said to him, too cheap to do that. That's extra money. And so Al says, well, I'll do a fold in.
So smart.
And that's how it started. Al told me that story, and I was like, oh my God, that is hilarious.
That's hilarious. That's amazing. I'd not heard that. Yeah, genius.
Working for Mad's been the greatest privilege of my life, and professionally, just being able to be a small part of that legacy, because they had some giants working for them. I mean, people who were legends.
Tonight, I said, before you came on, I said to Chris, I was like, I went to my box of Mads, some of which I had that, like, I bought, like, this is before my time, some of which that are old, some of which I also have cracks.
Yeah.
Got some cracks here.
You did 5 minutes at Cracked, right?
I worked for Crack briefly. Yeah. I got some good Crack stories. Or really, the story of my getting my first job for Mad is kind of a funny Cracked story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you that real quick. So when I finally decided I wanted to really try to get into Mad was 1999, and I was president of the National Caricatures Network at the time, and so we had a mini convention that we sometimes would do around a speaker or something, and in of all places, New Britain, Connecticut, which is this little Connecticut town.
I know where that is.
It was the opening leg, the opening tour of this Al Hirschfeld retrospective. And Al Hirschfeld had never had his work displayed in a traveling show outside of New York. It was all at the Margot Feldstein Galleries, or whatever her name is. That's the only place you could see Al Hirschfeld originals. And he had this show. And it opened in New Britain, Connecticut, this little tiny museum, because he knew the guy.
Yeah, it's such a cute little museum.
Yeah, he knew the guy who owned it. They were friends. And so that's why I opened there. So we all went to New Britain, Connecticut, the NCN, and we had a mini con there, and we went to the show, and we got to meet Hirschfeld, and I interviewed him for the newsletter and stuff.
Mm.
And so we needed a guest speaker because Hirschfeld wasn't going to do it. And so I invited Sam Viviano, who had just become the art director of Mad Magazine right before that. And so he drove into New Britain from New York, and spent the weekend with us. And I was excited because I was going to have Sam Viviano all to myself for like a whole weekend. I get to show him my work. So I wrote and drew a parody of the movie Godzilla with Matthew Broderick from '98. It was like a year earlier. So I did this whole parody, and I showed it to Sam. And he said, yeah, the stuff is really good and we like it, but it's not quite there. You're not quite there yet, is what he told me. He says, you need to develop your work more. Maybe he thought I was a little too Mort Druckery, because at the time I was really looking at Mort's stuff to try to figure out how to do these parodies well.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you can't do that. You can't look at somebody's work and then start doing your own thing. It's going to bleed in, So anyway, I showed him my stuff and he thought it was okay. And he said, keep sending me work. So at the same time, Cracked magazine had just been bought by American Media, a tabloid. It was actually two tabloids that merged, and Cracked went along with one of them, the Inquirer, I think. And they took one look at Cracked's bottom line and said, we're canceling this. Wow. And there was a cartoonist that worked for him as an art director named Dick Culpa, and he said, I'm going to save Cracked magazine. Give it to me and I'll save it. So the first thing he did was chop his page rate to 0 almost, and all the big guys, John Severin and Brian Bollinger and Wally Brogan and all these guys that had been working for him for such a long time said, that's it, I'm not working for these peanuts. So they had to find all new artists. So there was a big thing about working for Cracked, send us your stuff. So I sent them that Godzilla piece and they published it. Like a 2-year-old movie, and they published it. And then I did a couple more pieces, and every time I would do another one, I would send it to Sam. And then, he'd look at it and say, oh, okay, yeah, things are getting better. Keep sending me work. So I wrote and drew a parody of The Sopranos for Cracked and sent that to Sam. And then I drew the art for the first X-Men movie parody, Cracked. And that was in color, because Cracked had a color section at the time. And then I sent that to Sam. And then I became a member of the National Cartoonist Society, and they had a Rubens Awards in New York. And so I went to New York for the Rubens, and I had just finished doing Gladiator for Cracked. And it was supposed to be in the color section. And it's a long story with Cracked, but they did not know what they were doing. Culpa didn't know what he was doing. He would change the aspect ratios on the art, squash it one way to make room for some marginal or something, and not do the corresponding narrowing. So everything was distorted. Yeah. Anyway, it's so what the straw that broke the camel's back for me with Cracked was I did this Gladiator splash page in color, and it was a crazy scene in the gladiator pit with tigers all over the place and the stands full of people, and
oh man.
And I painted the crap out of this thing, and then I found out that they decided to bump it into the black and white section because there was another movie that was going to be way bigger than Gladiator that they wanted to make sure got in the color section. That movie was Battlefield Earth.
Oh no!
So that just goes to show you
the classic,
the level they were operating at. Anyway, so I was really mad at those guys at that time, and so I showed Gladiator to Sam, just the black and white art, and this time he said, "Okay, this Nick Meglin was there too," and he showed Nick Meglin. He was one of the editors, and he said, "This is exactly what we wanted to see from you. Your own style is coming through. You've got a great handle on storytelling. Everything is just clicking here. But we don't know when we can give you a job, because what happens with Mad is you've got all the main artists and they get all the jobs. And then if they're busy doing stuff and they got something else, they'll go kind of to the next tier of artists. So getting a tryout for them, even at that time, was pretty hard." So he said, "So we don't know when we're going to be able to give you any work." And I said, "Okay, I get it. He says, "And the other thing is, you can't work for Mad and Cracked at the same time." And I said, "Well, that's okay, because I don't work for Cracked anymore." And he said, "When did that happen?" And I said, 3 seconds ago.
Yeah.
And he said, wait a minute. I don't know when I can give you a job." And I said, "That's okay. I'm done with Cracked." And I had already told those guys I'd already decided I wasn't going to. So, but then I actually got a job, for Mad, like maybe about 2 or 3 months later. And, after that, it was I had a shaky start. I sent them, I did a piece for them for a tryout, and it got bumped from the issue because it was an evergreen piece that they could put in any time. And, and a lot of times those get bumped for something that's timely. And so I kind of thought I'd blown it because they didn't publish my piece, and then they were doing some online stuff at the time. Believe it or not, in 2000, they were doing stuff for AOL, and they had a website that had original work on it, and they had me do a couple things for their website, and then they'd have me do another piece that ended up being my first piece in Mad in October of 2000. And then, after that, got a lot of
How many issues at this point?
Over 150.
So in my box of Mad magazines is this issue, which has Boom.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It has this one.
Yeah.
Which,
Ready Player One.
Yeah, that was cool to look through and see. That's all. That it's amazing. It must have been an amazing feeling to see your work for the first time. And
yeah, it was. To be in an issue of Mad and have my byline in it and my art. I threw a party. We had a Mad party at our place, and had copies of the magazine. But my ultimate goal was to do the movie and TV parodies, and then the first couple pieces I did were other things, and then. But it was very quickly I ended up getting a parody, and Sam still says this has nothing to do with it, but I think I started getting that work because Mad was switching to color at that time, and I could color my own work. And Mort refused to color his work, and he refused to, the parodies stuff. He'd do like one-page things and covers, but not parodies. And he also refused to allow anybody to color his work. So they couldn't have a color house color it. They did that with Angelo. They had Color House, or I can't remember what the name of some of those color places were that DC used to color their books. And so they would color Angelo's stuff. And I didn't think it looked very good. It was like comic book, slick comic book coloring on this cartoon illustration, and it just didn't match, But they needed the stuff to be done in color, and I could do it.
And you were doing watercolor back then?
No, I was doing digital.
Okay, so pretty early doing digital.
Yeah, I switched to primarily digital color work in the late 90s. Like, when you were still using Intuos tablets and looking at your screen while you're drawing.
It's like drawing with a potato.
Yeah. I never used a mouse. I always used a stylus.
To the original Wacom tablet.
The big ones that were, had like 24 levels of pressure sensitivity or something like that.
Right.
It was tough, but it got me, the look I wanted, and I used Photoshop, and I still do the same thing. I still use Photoshop. I still use, some kind of pressure sensitive tablet. I've got both a Wacom now, and I've got a Accents tablet. That's like a newer company that makes a good tablet. I got a portable one of those that I use sometimes. So I taught myself that. There was no digital anything when I was going to college.
Yeah.
So I had to teach myself how to do that. But it was obvious to me that was the future. Like, you were going to have to deliver your work digitally. You couldn't send in a piece of board that they'd send out to color separate. Imagine trying to do that today. Like, there are no color houses. There's no drum scanners. There's no place to get color separations done. Art director would be like, what? You're going to send me a piece of, I don't have a scanner big enough to scan that.
Right. Yeah.
I worked somewhere where they had a giant camera room.
Yeah.
They'd take shots of artwork, and
I
was working there.
Photostats.
We got the very first iMac, which had a colored bubble back, and that was plopped on our desk, and we were told, yes, you will Photoshop now. And then the poor guy, Val, who worked in the camera room, got very lonely.
I bet. Yeah. We used to have a stat camera in our school. So we would do film pauses and halftones and screen, stuff. And there were a few jobs I did early on where I did the film pause overlays and painted the boards with a blue line behind it, the old style comic book type stuff. Yeah. And then you would have to use registers to register your line. And so the lines would get stripped into the black plate, and then they would color separate the color. And it was all just a I did one job once, and this was for Rolaids. And Rolaids every year had the Rolaids Relief Man Award for baseball. And they had this little brochure thing. It was about 4 inches wide by about 8 inches tall. And they always had a cover on it. And Mort used to do those covers.
Oh.
And he didn't want to do the job anymore. And I was working for Mad, and they called me and they asked me to do it. And so I did that film pause thing, and sent it to him. The line work on the acetate and then the painting on the board behind it. And I can't remember what year this was, but the art directors and the production people had no idea what that was. So they just taped the acetate onto the board and put it on a flatbed scanner and scanned the shiny acetate.
Wow.
And the print job looked terrible. It looked fuzzy, and I never got a job back from them again. But it wasn't my fault. I just used the technique I used was outdated at the time, and I don't know. So
that show, they had a bunch of the Mort Druckers had the Ruby list. The cut.
Yeah.
Explain. We were there with our MFA group. And there's lots of very young people in the MFA group. And I had to explain to all of them. I was like, what is that red stuff? I was like, oh, back in my day.
Yeah. Yeah. I have some original Mad art that's got ruby lith and amber lith on it, with little notes, 30% gray, and some artists I'd have visit my studio and be like, what's with the red?
Right.
Have to explain it to them. I did one of the pieces I did in the Claptrap book was, it was the Citizen Kane parody, and that was, I tried to duplicate, there we go. I tried to duplicate like the old style, comic book style, but in black and white. So I used a craft tint effect, all digital, right? But it's the same thing where the craft tint washes, and I used to do that. I used to have craft tint board. I think it's like they don't have it anymore. But I'm pretty sure I'm probably going to live 10 years less lifespan because of the chemicals.
Right. Yeah.
It's going to knock some years off my life.
Yeah. I think about that sometimes, like when I was younger, and it'd be like my brush, like the bristles on my brush are like all separating at a home. Yeah.
But yeah, that probably wasn't good.
2 years.
Yeah.
Chris, you studied with Chris Payne, right?
Yeah, we both did.
You did too, Kelly. Oh, so Chris, one time I was chatting with him, and he demonstrated his technique, and I don't know if he still does it, where he used to do watercolor or I think watercolor base, and then he would take this photo retouch spray that had like a textural quality to it. It was made for spraying photos, and then you could take watercolor or medium and paint right on top of it. It would seal the photo, but create like a textury sort of feel to it. And then you could do washes and color washes on top of these photographs. And Chris would spray his whole thing, and then he would do like watercolor on top of that, and then use an eraser to erase out color and stuff. So he built all these layers up with this photo retouch spray. And then he told me, he said, first of all, what I would do is I had to go outside because this stuff was so toxic. And I would hold my nose and I'd spray my board, and then I'd run away. And then he said, and there's probably a hole in the ozone right directly over my house because of this stuff. Yeah, toxic art supplies.
But it looks amazing.
Yeah. He would use a kneadable eraser and like erase out he would do the whole watercolor wash and then erase out highlights. It was just an unbelievable process.
Yeah.
But it created this very distinct painted look.
His work, there's so much texture in it. And he has like 5 different ways that he works, to get it. And like you look at his originals and you're like, oh, which way is this? How did he do that? It's always so speckly. It has so much like life in the color.
Yeah. Love his stuff.
Yeah. And even after he shows you how to do it, that doesn't mean you can do it. It's like,
no,
it's still some kind of alchemy and magic going on.
For sure.
Cool. Well, yeah. So you mentioned the Claptrap.
Yep. That's a book that, Desmond Devlin, a writer for Mad, and I did that book, came out a little over a year ago now. And Mad stopped doing new material, in like 2020. And we decided we still wanted to do movie parodies, so we did a book full of them. And crowdfunded it, and that was interesting. Took a lot longer to do than we thought it was going to do, but we persevered and got it out, and I'm pretty proud of that book. It was a lot of fun to do, and we worked really hard on it, and I thought it turned out well.
That the joy and the hard work paid off. It's a masterpiece, and it's really great. As many Mad issues as you've done, as many parodies as you've done, you have to go to those issues, or some of the collections have a few, but to have a book that has all your parodies is really a nice book to have, collected under one cover like that.
Yeah.
It'd be great if Matt would do, the Richmond book one of these days. But
I could think of a few other Mad artists that need a book long before I do.
Eventually they'll get to you.
Yeah, who knows?
But
you never know.
But it is an awesome. It turned out amazing.
Thanks.
How many years to actually draw?
It took us over 2 years to do it. From start to finish, probably close to 2.5. And then it was 3 years from the time we did the crowdfunding to the time the book actually came out. But part of that was because it took 5 months to print the damn thing. Like we turned the files in August of 2023, and we got the book in January of 2024. By the time they finally landed on my doorstep, so we could send it out to people. So didn't anticipate it would take quite that long, but the pandemic really had a bad effect on shipping, and it hadn't recovered. It took 2 months just on the boat,
Luckily, those boats didn't tip over. There were lots of boats that tipped over and books were lost. And
man, that would have been awful. That would have been awful.
About the parodies, though, it was my favorite thing when we were at the Mad show. I didn't get to see the movie Saturday Night Fever. I was too young to go into the theater, but I had the Mad magazine. So when I actually saw the movie, I was like, no, because I saw the parody version of it.
No, John Travolta's supposed to be saying Attica, Attica, Attica right at this moment.
So, you have on your website, a TV guide. You have your sketches, and it's in the TV guide cover format. And that's a whole nother thing. There's something about the caricatures of these people who become touchstones of our lives, and so many great caricature artists have done TV guides. Al Hirschfeld did TV guides, and of course Jack Davis did TV guides. And so seeing you do it too, it's kind of oh. It has this cool, it's nostalgia, but to see, modern stars caricature, I said to Chris that there are people probably 10 years younger than us. They don't get the TV guide thing, but TV guide was everything. It came to us, and you're and you look through it every week. It was so good.
Yeah, I loved getting TV guide and the artwork on the covers. Of course, it wasn't always artwork. It was often photographs, mostly photographs. But right. Bruce Stark was another artist that did a lot of TV guide covers that were caricatured and were really, really great.
Yeah.
And and I'm fortunate I never actually did a TV guide cover. Right. But I did a bunch of homages to it with that sketchbook, and then the one for the movie, the Tarantino movie.
Right.
It was fun. But that was another thing that I just loved, seeing that and recognizing Jack's work, from Mad, knowing this is one of the Mad guys, and here he's doing this other stuff. And then he would do movie posters, that you would see, and that were really big. And that, he was an American icon in illustration on so many levels. Probably the most successful Mad artist, I think, out of all of them.
And hugely influential, for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, hugely influential. We did a thing in at the Savannah College of Art and Design in 2009 or something. They had a Mad SCAD weekend, and they invited a bunch of mad artists down there, and Jack was one of them. And he had a little trouble getting around. You know, he was in his late 80s, I think, at the time, and or something like that. And so, you know, he was struggling with the cane and just the chipper Southern gentleman that he always was. Anyway, but my wife Anna was with, and she sort of took him under her wing and, you know, helped him around and stuff. So we were going through one of the animation departments at SCAD, and you know, Jack was just walking around, and there were these two girls that were working on some project at a workstation on a computer or whatever, and he goes over and he goes, you know, that's some beautiful work. You ladies are so talented. You know, he's so good. And in his little Southern accent, you know, and they're like, oh, it's cute. Look at the little old man is telling me how good I am. That's so nice. Thank you, little old man. And then he'd walk away, and Anna walked over to him and looked at him and said, that's Jack Davis from Mad Magazine. Those girls knew who Jack Davis was. They were like, their eyes got really big. They were like, oh my God. And they got up and they ran over and they got their pictures taken with them. And then he drew some sketches for them. So even the young people still knew who he was. He's that influential.
That's amazing. This is still available and awesome and highly recommended, obviously.
Just have not too many copies left of that now.
Oh.
A little over 200
prints coming up.
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. There's a little talk. Des and I are starting to talk about doing another one. So
cool. Yeah.
We'll see about that. I don't know if I'll live long enough to get it done, but you never know.
Well,
visit me online. I always post. I get a Substack, a free weekly newsletter that if you want to keep up with what I'm doing, and I do a new sketch every week, and I I have stories about the freelance biz and news about this or that and new projects and stuff. So you can keep up with me that way. And, I still post on social media, Instagram and stuff. So find out what I'm doing if you're interested.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it was really great and a lot of fun. For sure, to hear your story, not just enjoy your artwork. So thanks so much. We're so grateful that you did this and that you gave us your time in our little podcast thing that we've decided to do.
I had a great time. Thank you for having me.